morning her mother was buried, Tessa Vane received divorce papers. Not at home, not through a lawyer's office, not with any kind of quiet dignity. Right there, at Greenfield Memorial Cemetery in Atlanta, Georgia, while the casket was still being lowered, and the pastor was still speaking, and her Aunt Ruth was still pressing a handkerchief to her mouth. Tessa's husband of 11 years walked up beside her, slid a manila envelope into her hands, and said, low enough that only she could hear, I think this is the right time. Clean break, no scenes. Tessa Vane, 37-year-old VP of Strategic Operations at Holloway Media Group, did not cry. She did not scream. She held the envelope with both hands and looked straight ahead at the casket and thought, with a clarity that surprised even her. He has no idea what he just did. Her mother, Lorraine Vane, 71, had died 6 days earlier from a stroke that came without warning on a Tuesday afternoon. Tessa had been in a board meeting when the hospital called. She'd left her phone face down on the conference table, habit from years of training herself not to look distracted, and by the time she stepped out, she'd missed 4 calls. The 5th one she answered in the hallway outside the elevator, and a nurse's voice told her to come quickly. She drove to Emory University Hospital alone. Her husband, Cornel Vane, 43, senior editor at Holloway Media Group's flagship magazine division, had texted back, at a dinner, will come when I can. He arrived 2 hours after Lorraine passed. Tessa had not said anything then either. Now she stood at the graveside with the envelope in her hands, and Cornel standing exactly 2 feet away from her, close enough to look like a grieving husband, far enough to signal something else entirely. Behind her, she heard her younger sister Dove inhale sharply. Dove had seen. The pastor finished. People began to move. Someone touched Tessa's shoulder and she turned and smiled and accepted condolences, and the envelope stayed tucked under her arm like a piece of ordinary mail. She did not open it at the cemetery. She did not open it on the drive home. She set it on the kitchen counter and made herself a cup of tea and stood at the window looking out at the backyard where her mother had once grown tomatoes. And she let herself feel the grief, real grief, not the performed kind, for exactly 17 minutes. Then she picked up her phone and called her attorney. What Cornel Vane did not know about his wife could fill several rooms. He knew she was smart. He'd always known that. It was part of what had attracted him initially, 12 years ago at a rooftop party in Midtown, where she'd been the only woman in a group of 5 who actually understood what they were debating about media consolidation. He'd pursued her hard for 3 months. She'd taken her time. They married in September, a small ceremony her mother had loved. He knew she worked long hours. He knew she had an MBA from Wharton, and that she'd climbed steadily through the ranks at Holloway Media Group since joining 15 years ago. He knew she made good money, good enough that when his career stalled 2 years ago after a restructuring, it hadn't been a crisis. What Cornel did not know was that Holloway Media Group did not simply employ Tessa Vane. Holloway Media Group was Tessa Vane. Not technically, not on paper, not in any document that bore her married name. The company had been founded by her grandfather, Bernard Holloway, in 1971. When Bernard died, it passed to Tessa's mother, Lorraine, who had spent 30 years building it from a regional print operation into a diversified media company worth, at current valuation, $420 million. 3 years before her death, Lorraine had transferred controlling interest to Tessa through a trust structure that Tessa's legal team had spent 8 months designing specifically to keep that ownership private. Tessa had not hidden this out of shame. She had hidden it because she understood, with the particular intelligence of someone who had watched her grandfather's legacy get picked apart by people who wanted proximity to money, that the moment her ownership became known, everyone around her would change. Colleagues, friends, her husband. She had wanted to know who Cornel Vane was when he thought she was simply an executive with a good salary and a corner office. For 11 years she had known. The picture was not flattering, but it was accurate, and accuracy was something Tessa had always valued over comfort. The thing about accuracy was that it prepared you. Cornel had met Farrah Kinsley, 31, approximately 14 months ago. Tessa knew this because she had access, as the beneficial owner of Holloway Media Group, to certain internal records that the Human Resources Department shared with the Executive Trust Office, not for surveillance purposes, but because the trust held liability exposure, and her attorneys had insisted on oversight protocols. She had not gone looking. She had simply, one afternoon in March, seen Farrah Kinsley's name appear on an expense report paired with Cornel's for a dinner at a restaurant in Buckhead that cost $340 and was coded as a talent acquisition meeting. There was no talent being acquired. Tessa had checked. Farrah Kinsley was an associate editor at the magazine division, reporting 2 levels below Cornel. She was, by any observable standard, ambitious and effective at her job. She had also, over the past year, received 2 off-cycle salary adjustments that Cornell had personally approved without documentation to the compensation committee. Tessa had flagged this quietly to Dowell Crane, 58, the company's chief legal officer and one of 3 people who knew the full scope of Tessa's ownership. Dowell had said, "Do you want me to?" "No," Tessa had said, "not yet." She had been waiting for something she couldn't quite name. Not proof, she had proof. Not pain, she was past pain. She was waiting. She realized much later for Cornell to do something so public, so irrevocable, that no version of events could be rewritten afterward. He had done it at her mother's graveside in front of 47 people with a manila envelope. The divorce filing named irreconcilable differences. Cornell's attorney, a man named Price, who wore good suits and had the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to winning, sent over an initial proposal within 10 days. The proposal was detailed and aggressive. It assumed Tessa's primary asset was her salary and her 401k. It made no mention of Holloway Media Group beyond the vague category of marital employment. Tessa read it at her kitchen table on a Saturday morning with her reading glasses on and a second cup of coffee going cold beside her. Then she called her own attorney, Millicent Oakes, 54, senior partner at Oakes & Farrell, who had represented the Holloway Family Trust for 19 years. "They filed based on the public picture," Tessa said. "They did," Millicent said. He doesn't know," Millicent confirmed. His attorney ran a standard asset search, found the salary, the real estate, the joint accounts. Nothing flagged the trust because the trust is structured correctly and your name isn't on it directly. Tessa was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, a cardinal landed on the fence post and stayed there. "Let him keep not knowing," she said finally. "For now." There was a pause on the line that meant Millicent was smiling. Understood. What happened next unfolded slowly, the way most significant things do when the person managing them is patient. Tessa moved into the guest room of her own house. She was civil to Cornell in the ways that mattered. They shared the kitchen without incident. They communicated about logistics through text. They did not fight. Cornell seemed relieved by this. He interpreted her composure as indifference, and indifference as evidence that she had already moved on emotionally, which made him feel better about himself. He began bringing Farah to events. Not to their home, even Cornell understood that was a line, but to industry gatherings, to dinners with colleagues, to the kind of places where people in Atlanta media ran into each other regularly. He introduced her as a colleague. Everyone understood what that meant. Tessa heard about it through people who thought they were being kind by telling her, and through people who simply couldn't help themselves. She thanked them all and said very little. What she was actually doing during those months was working. Not simply working, she had always worked, but working in a specific direction. The board of Holloway Media Group held its quarterly meeting in November. Tessa, in her capacity as controlling shareholder operating through the trust, had an agenda item she'd requested be added 2 weeks prior. The item was labeled in the official materials, Organizational Review, Editorial Division Leadership. Dowell Crane had distributed the board packet. He had also, at Tessa's request, compiled a document that outlined, in clinical and well-sourced detail, the compensation irregularities in the magazine division over the past 14 months, 2 unauthorized salary adjustments, 1 expense account pattern that did not conform to company policy, and 1 instance of a subordinate employee being elevated to a project lead role on a major brand partnership without going through the standard approval process. The subordinate employee was Farris Kinsley. The approving executive was Cornell Vane. The board met on a Thursday. Tessa sat at the head of the table in the Holloway Media Group boardroom, on the 14th floor of their Midtown office building. The same building where Cornell worked, 4 floors below. She'd been in this room hundreds of times. She ran these meetings with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. That Thursday, she let Dowell present the editorial division findings. She watched the board members' faces as the details came out. She watched Wallace Prentice, 66, the longest-serving board member, and a man who had known her grandfather, adjust his glasses and read the expense summary twice. "This was approved at the senior editor level?" Wallace asked. "Twice," Dowell said, "without committee review." Wallace looked at Tessa. "What's your recommendation?" "Termination for cause," Tessa said. "Effective immediately, pending HR's standard process." The vote was unanimous. Cornell Vane learned he had been fired on a Thursday afternoon at 4:17 p.m. when his access badge stopped working at the elevator, and a representative from Human Resources met him in the lobby with a sealed envelope and a request to surrender his company laptop. He called Tessa from the parking garage. She let it ring. He called again. She was in her car 2 blocks away, having left the building through the executive entrance on the side street. the one that required a separate keycard that not many people in the company knew existed. She answered on the third call. Did you know about this? His voice was tight in a way she hadn't heard before. Not grief. Cornel didn't grieve easily. It was something closer to the specific panic of a man who has just realized the board beneath his feet was never as solid as he thought. About what? She said. They fired me, Tessa. They said policy violations. This is. He stopped. Did you have something to do with this? She looked at the intersection ahead. The light was red. Cornel, she said, you should talk to your attorney. My attorney handles our divorce. This is different. Yes, she agreed. It is. She ended the call. The light turned green. The revelation did not happen in a single dramatic moment because Tessa was not interested in dramatic moments. She was interested in facts, and facts had a way of emerging on their own schedule. Price, Cornel's divorce attorney, discovered the existence of the Holloway family trust through the discovery process. Once, Millicent filed the amended asset disclosure in December. The amended disclosure was thorough and precise, and included, for the first time, a complete picture of Tessa's position as the controlling beneficial owner of Holloway Media Group, the $420 million company that had just terminated his client for cause. Tessa was told that Price had to sit down when he read it. She was told this by Millicent, who had it from Price's paralegal, who had mentioned it to a mutual colleague in the way that people cannot help but mention things that are simply too remarkable to keep entirely to themselves. Cornel called 3 more times over the 2 days following the disclosure. Tessa did not answer. On the 4th call, she picked up. He was quieter than she expected. She had prepared for anger. Cornel expressed most things as anger, but what came through the phone was something flatter, something that sounded, if she was being precise, like a man who had finally understood something that had been true for a very long time and simply not visible to him. You own it, he said, not a question. Yes, the whole company, controlling interest, through my mother's trust, which transferred to me 3 years ago. A long pause. She could hear him breathing. And you never? No, she said, I never told you. Another pause. Why? She thought about how to answer that. She had several answers available. She could have said, because I wanted to know who you were without it. She could have said, because my grandfather taught me that money changes people, and I needed to see you unchanged. She could have said, because I was right to wait. What she said was, because it was mine, Cornel. It was always mine. He didn't have an answer for that. The divorce settlement took 4 months to finalize. Tessa kept the house. Cornel received a settlement based on his documented salary history and the joint marital assets they had accumulated during the marriage. The accounts, the vacation property in Asheville, a portion of his pension. The Holloway family trust was protected under its structure as a premarital inheritance asset, and Millicent had documented the transfer timeline carefully enough that no credible argument could be made to the contrary. Price had tried. Millicent had not needed to try very hard in response. Farrah Kinsley had quietly resigned from Holloway Media Group 2 weeks after Cornel's termination, before the formal HR process concluded. She sent a brief email to the editorial department that said she was pursuing other opportunities. No one who knew the full story was particularly surprised. In February, 8 months after the cemetery, Tessa Vane walked into Holloway Media Group's Midtown office building through the main entrance on Peachtree Street for the first time as something other than an executive employee. She had always used the side entrance, the quiet one, the one that required the separate card. It was habit. It was also, she recognized, a kind of hiding, not shame, but the particular discretion of someone who has chosen to be underestimated. That Tuesday in February, she used the front door. The lobby was high-ceilinged and bright, with a wall of windows that faced east and caught the morning light. The security desk was staffed by a man named Henry who had worked the main entrance for 9 years and knew everyone by face, if not by name. He looked up when she came in. Good morning, he said. Good morning, Henry, she said. She crossed the lobby to the elevator bank. She pressed the button for the 14th floor, where the executive offices and the boardroom were. The floor she had always worked on. The floor that, it turned out, had always been hers. The elevator doors opened. She stepped in. Behind her, the lobby returned to its ordinary morning rhythm. The turnstiles, the badges, the coffee cups, the quiet low sound of a building full of people beginning their day. Tessa faced forward and watched the floors tick upward on the small panel above the doors. The number reached 14. The doors opened. She walked out.